Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Rewilding Network webinar. My name is Sarah King. I'm Rewilding Manager at Rewilding Britain, and it's great to see you all here to listen to a topic around marine rewilding, which we don't do as many webinars around marine rewilding. So it's fantastic to be able to get some learnings and coverage of marine. Um, this has been set up as a normal Zoom meeting. So in a minute, we're going to go into a presentation. But if you've got any questions along the way, or if you've got any comments, use the chat box, and we'll pick up as many questions as we can at the end. Or it might be that you can put your questions directly to the team at the end of the presentation. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Coast, and they're going to talk about some of the work that they've been doing over the last 12 to 18 months.
Cool. Awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for hosting this webinar for us today. If you guys give me 1 minute and I'll try share my presentation and then we can get going from there. Great. So hopefully you can all see that. Great, cool. Yeah, so thanks so much for giving up your lunch time today for the talk. Please feel free to munch away on your lunch. Just make sure yourself is muted. And as Sarah said, we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So just to introduce myself, my name is Áine Purcell-Milton. I'm the director at Coast. I'm going to be sharing the presentation today with my colleague Lucy Kay, who's the MPA project officer. So I'll hand over to her after a few introductory slides. Our presentation today is discovering the depth of Coast. So today what we're going to talk about is do a really quick intro to Coast, just whiz through the history, and then really focus on Coast's research and the research strategy that Lucy will be covering. Just wanted to thank so much to Rewilding Britain, and they've supported the Coast research work through the Innovation Fund, and we're hugely supportive of them. They're an amazing funder. They make it as easy as possible for us, so that's really appreciated. Great. So just to put it just to orientate everybody to where we are. Oh, sorry, I think there's, oh, great. Thanks so much for muting yourself there. Just to orientate yourself. So we're Coast, stands for the Community of Arran Seabed Trust. We're based on Arran, and so this is in just off the west coast of Scotland. It's in the Firth of Clyde. So Arran, the size of Arran is 432 kilometers squared. We have a resident population of about 5,000, with the majority of the population being based around the coast. We are a very kind of tourism-focused island, so our population goes up by threefold really in the summer. And Arran is known as Scotland in miniature because it's got a bit of everything on it. Cool. So just to go on to a little bit of context then. So this is a map back in 1725 of the Clyde. Arran's right in the middle there, and we've got Kintyre over to the left. So it's really just to showcase that this is a map from the past, and it showcases how highly productive these areas were for fishing and the level of species that we had within the Clyde. And they saw that it was so important that they actually put it on the map. So you can see down at the bottom, you can say here is plenty of cod and ling. So the Firth of Clyde was really, really productive. And so there's a record of in 1847, Arran had 98 boats dedicated to fishing. And so we'll go through the context now, but the story of Arran and the Clyde is unfortunately very different now. Great, so the story kind of begins in the late 1880s. And so at this time, there's growing concerns about the impact of bottom trawling on the seabed. And so as a result, the government at the time wanted to protect our fishing ground. And so as a result, the whole of the Clyde was closed to bottom trawling. And then around the whole of Scotland, there was a 3-mile limit prohibiting bottom trawling within that area. So this is a really kind of, far-sighted decision that they made at the time. But unfortunately, more recently in the 20th century, overfishing and the demand to open up more areas to fishing, and instead of addressing the root causes of overfishing, they decided to open up more areas to bottom trawling. And so what we saw then was in the Clyde in the 1960s, areas outside the 3-mile limit were opened up to bottom trawling. And what we were seeing then was fish catches decreasing. And so then there was further pressure coming on board because of this decline. And so then, like a really kind of important date is in 1984, then the 3-mile limit was removed, and not just in the Clyde, but in all of Scotland. So that allowed fishing vessels to come very, very close to shore. And there was an increase in scallop dredging that really led to, I suppose, widespread trawling and dredging within these areas and a huge decline within the health of the inshore waters. So just to go back to bottom trawling. So here's 2 pictures of the effects of dredging on marine habitat. So when we talk about bottom trawling, the big issue with it is that it has a massive impact on the seabed. It's physically damaging and leads to a huge amount of habitat loss. So scallop dredges are these, I'm sure you guys will know, but just quickly to go through are, they are kind of these very hard cages are dragged along the seabed, and they have metal teeth that act kind of like a rake along the seabed. So really damaging anything along that top layer. And so this type of fishing method is hugely destructive and completely wipes out any kind of vulnerable habitats. So yeah, we'll just go on. And so in the Clyde then, opening up all areas to bottom-towed trawling and dredging had a catastrophic effect on fisheries. And so as you can see in the coloured graph, so this is from the Clyde Ecosystem Review from Marine Scotland in 2012, that we see that populations dramatically decreased over time. And you see this decline as well from the removal of the 3-mile limit. And so what is happening now is that we've completely kind of removed all white fish populations within the Clyde, and really we're fishing to the bottom of the food chain. And so this coincided with a more local kind of festival that we had on Arran called the Lamlash Fishing Festival. And so we can see catches of that festival throughout the years, and you can see this huge decline coinciding with that, the opening up of further ground to bottom trawling. And so then, unfortunately, this was cancelled in the 1990s. So with this kind of loss of, I suppose, species and habitat was noticed by the community of Arran. And in particular, there was 2 members, Don McNeish and Howard Wood, that were local divers that saw this destruction with their own eyes when they were out diving, and really became very passionate about trying to protect their local waters. And so they came together with other members of the community and established Coast in 1995. And so really what they wanted to do was protect the rich fishing heritage for future generations, educate people, and do research to figure out more about why this was happening, and then campaign for further protection. So I'll quickly go through the timeline on the next slide. But what happened then, after a number of years of campaigning, was that we were able to get protection within the waters around Arran. And so what we have now is we have a small no-take zone. which was established in 2008. So it just goes from, you'll see that little pink area here, goes from Holial back to Arran. And then nestled, that no-take zone is nestled within the larger South Arran MPA, which was designated as part of an MPA network that Scottish Government were developing. But at the time when it was established in 2014, it didn't have any fisheries management measures or any kind of protective measures. So it really meant it was kind of just lines on a map. So the next 2 years, Coast and the community came together to really push for proper protection within the South Arran MPA. And so now we have these kind of spatial fisheries management measures. So dredging is not allowed within any of the South Arran MPA. The purple box shows where, out with that to the yellow line, where trawling can happen. And then we have other areas where creeling can't happen. So these green boxes are for where creeling is prohibited. And these areas are usually merle or seagrass. So they're very fragile. So you wouldn't, if you did drop creels in this area, it would be damaging for them. So quickly, just to go through a timeline at Coast. We were established in 1995, got the no-take zone in 2008, got the larger South Arran Marine Protected Area with fisheries management measures in 2016. Then we were very lucky to open up our Discovery Centre in 2018. And then we had the arrival of our research vessel in 2022. And so Lucy will go on to talk more about research. And I think it was just important to put that into context for the whole wider picture of Coast. So Coast is a broad, our aims are broad. And not only are we trying to conduct research, but we want to showcase community-led marine conservation. So we want to empower communities. Not only do we want to educate people, but we want to inspire action. We want to use our evidence to influence policymakers. And then all of this, we want this to support the Arran economy as well. Perfect. So I will hand over to Lucy Kay. She'll kind of tell the story of research within Coast.
That's great. Thanks, Áine. Can everybody hear me okay? Just check things working. Lovely, thanks. So a key purpose, obviously, of the kind of the no-take zone and then getting the marine protected area has been to protect and recover the marine environment around parts of Arran. And as Áine's already alluded to, very early on, Coast was interested in having studies in place that helped inform about what those measures were leading to in terms of change of marine life in the seas around Arran. How were things responding to the protection that had been put in place? And the people who founded Coast weren't marine biologists, and so very early on they reached out to people, sort of specialists in the field. And these are some very early photographs. So there's Dr. Bill Ballantyne, who is the leading light for marine reserves in New Zealand, and all marine reserves in New Zealand, the legislation is for them to be no-take, and that was one of the inspirations for the no-take zone originally. And then also Professor Callum Roberts, who has done a lot of work about the value of marine protected areas generally, and also Dr. Bryce Stewart, who is a specialist within particular shellfish fisheries. And it was these early conversations and sort of collaborative discussions that really provided the basis for the research programme, if we can call it that, that has developed on Arran since then. Could you put the next slide, please, Áine? I think it's quite useful just to think about what we mean about research, because the word probably means different things to different people. And in the perspective of how we use it at Coast, we use it very broadly to encompass all sorts of different types of surveys and studies. And we tend to think of these as sort of, as fitting into kind of three main categories of study type. The first one is about understanding kind of what we've got, where it is, how much there is of it. So really kind of baseline surveys and observations. I'd also include in here things like personal natural heritage data and evidence and knowledge, written historical evidence. I think all comes into that and plays an important part in our understanding of what we have, what we've had, and how things might be changing. There's also about just how the whole system functions, what the conditions of the habitats and species are that we have, how do they interconnect, what do we get from them, and what effect are we having on them by different activities. And then also we see within the research overall is as how we connect with the sea in terms of it providing jobs and livelihood, but also in terms of other values that we put on it, and also raising questions about, well, how should we manage it? What are the views about how people see that the local sea area should be managed into the future? Put the next slide up, please, Áine. So I think all these different aspects of research are really important in the sort of looking at the programme overall. And the value of it obviously is providing evidence to underpin future decision making. So Coast has been involved in research since the early 2000s, and it really started with local citizen scientists, local divers, making observations of marine life and habitats around Arran as part of the UK Sea Search project. And this has provided a huge amount of baseline data for what we know about habitats and species around Arran, and continues to today. And the sort of research has then kind of expanded out from that. The nature of our involvement in research really varies. So from having local people on the ground doing data collection, sometimes it might be that we input to online research and surveys through interviews or online questionnaires to provide a sort of Arran perspective, if you like, into people's research. We help researchers with fieldwork and logistics on the ground, as well as developing our own research activities that we want to take forward and undertake. So whether that's on the shore or in the water with snorkelers and divers, and now with having the Coast Research boat, RV Coast Explorer, we're doing a lot more actually boat-based work as well, which is really exciting. Next slide, please, Áine. So this slide is just to kind of give a flavour of the sort of some of the areas of work that we've been involved with the research. So it's very varied, from baseline surveys to more in-depth studies of particular habitats and species, and working with researchers and universities. So things like looking at carbon in sediments in different parts of the protected areas. One of the really exciting things about that sort of zoning of the spatial areas of the protected areas that Áine showed you in the map, it's really quite unique really in a UK situation to have a really highly protected area, either no-take zone, nestled within this kind of degrees of spatial zoning of fisheries management. So you've got different degrees of protection from different types of fisheries within the South Arran Marine Protected Area. And it provides really interesting opportunities to see, well, what happens under those different scenarios? What kind of change do you see over time with that sort of management measure in place? We've been really fortunate to work with a lot of different researchers and universities and support a number of undergraduate and MSc and PhD projects. I think one of my real disappointments is that there wasn't a comprehensive programme of research put in place for the no-take zone and the marine protected area. There are aspects of work that are funded through Scottish Government and Scottish Government's agencies, but they weren't sustained over any period of time. And the no-take zone is still Scotland's only no-take zone. And you know, it's important for us to understand how such areas can contribute to recovery of the marine environment so that it can help inform better decisions about management of Scotland's seas as a whole. The next slide, please, Áine. Before I go on to have a just describe some of the sort of like the key research findings that we particularly wanted to share with you today, I wanted to talk about some recent work that we have been doing and to develop a research strategy for Coast And this was funded, and we were only able to complete it with support from Rewilding Britain's Innovation Fund. The marine research that has happened to date has kind of evolved organically. Some of the research that's now become part of the long-term monitoring started as a one-off year-long research project, and then we were able to get funding to carry it on from year to year. So while all the data has contributed to our understanding, we were kind of recognised that there was a lack of continuity in some aspects of the research, that there were gaps as well, things that we thought would be nice to look at, but that we weren't looking at all. And also that we needed to consolidate the information we had for the research to date. And that's really what led us to wanting to develop something, a more of a sort of structured framework that would actually provide clarity to us and others about what has gone before, but also help us prioritise future research projects, and also to identify how we might try and actually fund that work going on into the future. So that's really was the reason behind wanting to develop a research strategy, to provide much more structure to how we go forward with the research. Next slide, please, Áine. So we've been working over the past few months to develop what we want this to look like. We started, we didn't know what it was going to look like. And I think I just want to describe briefly the kind of process we wanted, because it might be useful for other people starting from like a perspective that we are as Coast, as a marine conservation charity, how we went about actually kind of putting the structure together. So although the main focus of the research at Arran has been the no-take zone and the marine protected area, Coast aims are much broader than just those protected areas. And the aims relate to the marine environment of Arran as a whole, and also the wider Clyde. They encompass the protection and recovery of that marine environment, but also, as Áine has already mentioned, about future sustainable use of the coasts and seas, about connecting people with the undersea world, and also empowering the community voice in decision making. So really the starting point that we took for the strategy was kind of identifying a series of research goals that reflected those objectives. Looking at other examples, that's kind of the approach that people have taken where they're working with maybe an individual MPA. And it made sense to kind of look at the breadth of coast objectives and actually think, well, what are the goals that that we aspire to from the research? And then from that, we narrowed it down to a series of 5 research themes, which I've shown on the slide here, so in the yellow. And then under these, we're identifying priority areas for research, and I've just put a few examples up on the slide. So the research themes are about, the actual environment, but they're also about the use of the environment and the management of the protected areas and Arran seas more generally. But we also identified we've got some really important work to do about managing the data that comes out of the research. Could give a whole talk about just the data probably, but it's quite a challenging area, just in terms of the accessibility, the storage and the management of the data. So it's an area of work that we've recognised that we really need to look at how we can put that into a better situation, working with like the national data sets and government agencies, so that data becomes more available for people to use. And we couldn't have done any of the research really without collaboration and partnership working. That's a key aspect of the strategy. And also communication, and not just sharing the findings with people, but how can we better engage people with the research projects overall, and the research findings, and what are maybe slightly more innovative, maybe arts-based ways, for example, that we might want to do that. Go on to the next slide, please, Áine. I'm going to go on in a bit just to talk about some of the research findings, but I just wanted to kind of, before I do that, is to kind of reflect on a question that I think is really important for the whole question of sort of rewilding and restoration, not just at Arran, and also relates to the research findings and how we interpret the research findings. And I think it's illustrated really well by this description from the Clyde in the 1870s, which I've looked at it many times, but I still find it absolutely fascinating, because it describes something that I think we would be really hard pushed to imagine today. I know we do see cetaceans within the Clyde, but this describes a scene of 40 whales and hundreds of porpoise circling away, you know, for at least a distance of 10 miles. This extraordinary scene of kind of large animal life within the Clyde. We know that the marine environment has changed substantially over the last 50 to 100 years, and we know that we've impacted large areas of seabed, and that there are species that we no longer commonly see. There's some other examples for Arran that I didn't include, so I'm concerned about time, but just indicate that there were things that were commonly seen in the 70s and 80s that we now no longer find in the waters around Arran, and certainly not in any abundance like they used to be. And I think it raises a really interesting question about what a recovered marine environment should look like. You know, when do we know we've succeeded in recovering seabed habitats and marine life? What species are we going to actually expect to see as a measure of that success? Dealing with marine environment, we know it's largely hidden from view, and it's really hard for us to know what the seas used to look like in the past, particularly the seabed habitats. And our tendency, and it includes with sort of, you know, government policy and strategies, very much to manage them around what we have now. And that's a lot less than it used to be in terms of biodiversity. But I think the sort of observational accounts such as this one and more recent ones, as I sort of mentioned earlier, are really important in terms of helping shape and guide our views as to what we might aspire to have back as a part of a recovered marine environment. Next slide, please, Sonia. So I'm going to come back to the bit about recovered marine environment a bit right at the end of the presentation, but I now want to go and actually talk about some of the key findings of a few of the pieces of research. There's a lot of research being done, and it'd be lovely to be able to kind of give you a comprehensive overview of it, but I just wanted to focus on some of the kind of the key aspects of research that I think are particularly important of what's happened to Arran. And I'm going to start with some work that was being done by the University of Glasgow, and this has been looking at the role different seabed habitats play in supporting the young, or we call them juvenile individuals of commercially important fish species, things like sort of cod and whiting and haddock. So they did this using a system using baited remote underwater video system, so that they put a piece of kit down and leave it on the seabed, and the videos running and record the fish that come in, and they have set up so they can look at kind of the size of the individuals coming in. Next slide, please, Áine. And this found that not all young fish behave in the same way. They have different preferences for the sort of seabed that they're happy in. In particular, juvenile cod, the young cod, like there to be more marine life on the seabed. They like a more complex seabed habitat. They're not particularly sort of bullish and confident fish when they're young. And so they like there to be a lot of marine growth so they can hide in this, and it provides obviously a kind of shelter and also a kind of feeding habitat. Whereas things like the whiting, they're a much more sort of aggressive fish when they're young, if you like, and they don't mind so much if you have kind of open areas of seabed habitat. And I think it's really important because it demonstrates the connection between the biodiversity on the seabed to a commercial species and as a part of its life cycle. And that's a really important connection that I think is often failed to be made in terms of policy, is that biodiversity is also about society and jobs and economy. It isn't just about biodiversity for biodiversity's sake. And I think this is a piece of evidence that demonstrates that in terms of important commercial fish species, the condition of the seabed is really vital to enable some of those to survive. And just if you have a look in the picture, you can probably notice there are some orange twiggy clusters, sort of twiggy bits in the picture. I'm going to come back, just take a note of them. They're an intriguing species, and I'm going to come back and talk about them just right at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Áine. So two of the really long-term studies that have been underway, looking at how marine life is changing in the no-take zone and the MPA, have focused on crustaceans, so lobsters and crabs, and also king scallops and the seabed marine life more generally. So I'm going to just share some of the results from those pieces of work, because they really are a key part of the long-term monitoring of the no-take zone and the MPA. Next slide, please, Áine. So I'm going to start with the work to do with the crustaceans. So this looks at 3 species, the European lobster and brown crab and velvet crabs. You've got some pictures there on the slide. And it uses standard fishing creels or pots in strings that are set in the no-take zone, and then also in areas outside the no-take zone in the marine protected area. And we have control areas close to the no-take zone, the near control, and then sites further afield at the southern end of Arran, which are the far control. So all the lobsters and crabs are counted and measured, and the lobsters are tagged, and everything gets put back into the sea after the sampling. Next slide, please, Áine. So some of the sort of like the main results coming out of this, and starting with the size of lobsters that have been caught. What we've seen is that on average, the size of lobsters is greater in the no-take zone over all years. And in most years, the proportion of the lobsters caught that are above the legal landing size is greater in the no-take zone compared to the control areas. We know that larger lobsters, the females, are able to carry more eggs, and they have a greater reproductive capacity, which obviously is making then a kind of more significant contribution to the kind of like population development at large. We haven't fully analysed all the tagging data, but it does show that lobsters don't stay in the no-take zone, which is maybe what we might have expected. And the distance that they have travelled based on the tagging data varies from just a few metres. But we have had one that actually travelled up to 15 kilometres. There's still a lot more for us to understand about how lobsters that are in the no-take zone, whether any are ever resident in the no-take zone, and also for those that are breeding, how much the no-take zone does or doesn't contribute to lobster population at large. So some interesting sort of results just based on the size of the lobsters. Next slide, please, Áine. Now, this slide goes on to look at the numbers of lobsters. So that's obviously another question about whether the protection is actually having an effect on the number that are found. And again, some really interesting results that have come out of this. And we look at the number based on catch per unit effort. So the catch related to the number of creels that are actually set. So the left-hand graph is showing the results for lobsters of all sizes. And the one on the right is showing the result for lobsters that are just those above the legal landing size. And you can see the no-take zone is the dark line, that in the early years, there were high numbers, whether of all sizes or above legal landing size, and then a really large increase. So a significant difference in around 2017 and 2018 of the numbers in the no-take zone compared to the control areas. But we then had a really significant drop. And unfortunately, we didn't have the funding to do the work in 2019, so we don't actually have the data points. So we don't know whether it's on that trajectory downward or somewhere else. And since 2020, the highest catch rate for lobsters of all sizes has actually been in the far control at the southern end of Arran. But if you compare the left-hand graph to the right-hand graph and look at the dotted line for the far control area in the left-hand one, you can see that when you compare to the graph showing legal size lobsters, the far control actually isn't very different. So that's telling us that actually a lot of the lobsters in the far control are under the legal size limit. So it does raise some interesting questions to whether there, are there sort of ecosystem influences, supporting recruitment of lobsters in the far control area. We don't know. It's another interesting area that it would be to look at in terms of overall kind of habitat contributions to the lobster fishery within the marine protected area as a whole. We did have a theory in terms of the drop in lobster numbers about having very large lobsters in the no-take zone, because they would command a greater territory and therefore maybe kind of scaring other smaller lobsters out. But that's we haven't actually been able to prove that. Although we've seen some very large lobsters, we haven't actually been able to prove that. Next slide, please, Áine. So the other long-term research has been looking at king scallops, another important commercial species, and other seabed marine life. And this work is undertaken by putting out a 50-metre transect on the seabed, which is videoed, and there's recording made of the species found along the transect. This work also started in 2010. originally in the no-take zone and then has been expanded out into the marine protected area as that site was designated. There's a sample of scallops that are collected from the transects, and these are measured and weighed as well and aged. Next slide, please, Áine. So one of the things we look at, similar to the lobsters, is the density of king scallops in the different areas. And I think the graph probably speaks for itself. It's interesting that there wasn't really a lot of change over the early years of the no-take zone, but you can see as you look to the right-hand side of the graph that there has been a substantial increase in the density of scallops, not only within the no-take zone, but also within the MPA, both the near and far control areas. The most recent survey we did was in 2022, and it's interesting how large the increase in the marine protected area was, particularly in the near control site. And we know from just the observations of scallop diving activity in the marine protected area, because that's an activity that can take place. It's only scallop dredging that's prohibited, that increase in scallops is providing a fishable resource that people can actually make use of. Next slide, please, Áine. And similar to the crustaceans, again, we kind of look at the sort of the size and age of the scallops in the different areas. And very similar to the lobsters, we find that in the no-take zone, they're larger and older scallops. And there's a higher proportion above the legal landing size in the no-take zone and the marine protected area. And as with the lobsters, larger scallops can carry more eggs. And so there's greater reproductive potential from those that reach a greater age. And also, if you have a greater density of scallops, they're what's called broadcast spawners. So they release the sperm and the eggs into the water for fertilization. So if you have a greater density, there's greater chances of successful fertilization of the eggs to go on to feed other areas. So some interesting examples. Some of you may be aware, we very unfortunately had an illegal fishing incident in the no-take zone last November, and that's just gone through the court procedures where we had people hand diving for scallops in the no-take zone. And it raises an issue about when you have these protected areas, you want to share the results, but equally by sharing the results, it can sometimes be actually saying to people, oh, look, there's a lot of stuff here. And it's an issue that we're unfortunately still dealing with the no-take zone and other things that we have to follow up with on that. Next slide, please, Áine. So just in terms of marine life more generally, so that was about the scallops, but just thinking about sort of marine life biodiversity on the seabed, we have seen increases in species richness, a number of species per area, and species density, number of individuals in the no-take zone and MPA. There isn't necessarily a linear trend. It isn't necessarily a single increase, but we're definitely seeing those changes with the data of the count data from the transect showing a doubling of species richness in the far control area, which is really exciting. And we've also, with the video data, we've just started to analyse that in more detail by taking screen grabs and looking at species within those images to give us a more detailed picture of changes in the benthic seabed marine life. And I'm just in the graphs here, this is some of the data from 2022, the most recent survey that we've done. Comparing data from the no-take zone to that of an area outside the protected areas that's still open to scallop dredging. So you can see there are significant differences in the abundance of different groups of species, but also just in terms of like the proportion of bare substrate that is present within the dredged area samples compared within the no-take zone. One of the most significant differences is in the top right-hand graph, and this is about the abundance of large seaweeds, macroalgae on the seabed, and there's way more seaweed in the survey transects in the no-take zone than compared to the dredge. And you might think, well, okay, it's seaweed, so what? But like I was saying about the fish, the seabed habitats, the kind of abundance of marine life and nature of marine life is really important for other species. And it is the case with really small scallops, juvenile scallops. So there's some pictures of them on the right-hand side. You can see how tiny these things are, but they like to settle out on other marine life. And when we've had episodes of scallop spat, settling out when we've been doing the surveys, we can see that there's proportionately more in the areas of the no-take zone. So indicating that this greater cover of marine life is actually really important. Next slide, please, Áine. So just going on to the last couple of slides now, and I wanted to come back to this this sort of question of what a recovering seabed might look like, but also I think to highlight again the value of observational records as a critical part of research. There are historical accounts and records that indicate that around the UK, much of the seabed habitats, including areas that we now just see as maybe sand, had much more of a crust of marine life covering them. So an example might be of a commercial species, things like records of native oyster beds, which we know were far more extensive in the past than they are now. Unfortunately, there's not that much information about what those species that made up this crust of marine life were, because people just didn't have the mechanism to go and look at it specifically. But, you know, there are records of older fishermen talking about the importance of this seabed crust to fisheries. Now, the orange twiggy clusters that I sort of highlighted in one of the earlier slides, they're this particular marine animal, which is a thing called a bryozoan. It's a particular group of marine species, and they come in all sorts of size and different growth forms. But this one forms a hard branching colony, a little bit like a coral, but it's a completely different animal. But it has a sort of like hard skeleton that is actually very fragile and would be very vulnerable to things like toad dredges and trawls. And this one's called the monkey puzzle bryozoan for obvious reasons of its shape. Now, normally, before coming to Arran, I would have only ever seen colonies of this that may be 1 or 2 centimeters high, and not commonly on a dive. You know, if you saw one, it was like, oh, I've seen one of the monkey puzzle bryozoans. So, you know, it's not something you see a lot of normally. Next slide, please, Áine. But we're starting to see unusually large colonies of monkey puzzle bryozoan in different locations in the no-take zone and the marine protected area at Arran. And it's not just the monkey puzzle bryozoan. We're starting to see it with clusters of other marine life, even on sandy habitats, where, you know, quite often people don't expect to see a lot of surface marine life because most of the things live in the sand. And you know, there does tend to be opinion that, you know, where you've got sandy habitats, it's always been sandy habitats. And maybe that isn't actually the case. And it was an observations by a local diver that first picked up the presence of the monkey puzzle bryozoan in the no-take zone and the MPA, and that we were seeing such unusually large colonies. The colonies that we're seeing are like fist and double fist sized. And, you know, having talked to bryozoan experts and marine biologists, this is really unusual. It's not how you'd normally find this particular species. We don't really know what this means. We know it's a big change in what's happening on the seabed. Is it some stage in the recovery of a crust? We don't know. It's certainly a change, and it really raises I think, some intriguing questions about what might happen in the future years in terms of the development of the marine communities on the seabed in the protected areas. And it's really only through sustaining kind of monitoring of these areas that we're going to really understand how things develop and change over time. Next slide, please, Áine. So this is the final sort of slide of the presentation. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on a few things, I guess, related to the research. I've already highlighted it really has been a key part of what has been developed at Arran, because it's, you know, it's providing evidence of the efforts of the community to get the protection in place, what that's actually meaning for the marine life in the seas around Arran. And I think one of the things it identifies is that, you know, community action really can make a difference, and communities really do have a key role to play in enabling the recovery of our seas. Without the no-take zone and MPA, you know, none of this would have developed. And it's the efforts of the people within the community and elsewhere that's actually made the research happen. I think the other key message is that we know that removing the most significant impacts from the seabed allows nature to recover. And I think that's a really important message, and that's evidenced by the research at Arran. And as I said before, the recovery of marine life has social and economic benefits. And again, that is evidenced by the research that has happened at Arran. There's a lot more that could be studied there for sure. But it's about the importance of us, seeing the context of biodiversity recovery in the marine environment in relation to our interests in it. I think part of the problem of putting protected areas in place is everybody expects everything to get bigger everywhere, all at once, all the time. And that just isn't the case. The environment's in a complex place, and the ecosystem changes and the ecological changes that happen, we don't really know what they're going to look like, particularly in the marine environment. And that just again highlights the importance of us having long-term studies, even in areas that wouldn't necessarily value for their biodiversity interests now. If we're protecting them, it's really important we start to look and actually understand, is there any change that happens? And if so, what is it? And what is it over the long term? And the results of this work and any other areas where this sort of work is taking place is not just about the locality, it's about informing our understanding about how change can happen if we protect the sea areas properly. And that's really important collectively for that to be shared. And finally, research isn't just for professional scientists, citizen scientists. Everybody has a really important role to play in helping contribute to research about the marine environment, because the contribution can be made in so many different ways, as I've just tried to kind of highlight a little through some of the slides. And the final slide, please, Áine. And Áine, before I finish, that was all I was going to cover. And Áine, I don't know if you've got any other final reflections you'd like to add.
No, Lucy, I think that's perfect. And yeah,